Is there evidence for the bodily resurrection of Jesus? The hope of the Christian and the truth of Christianity in many ways rises or falls with whether or not Jesus really was raised bodily from the grave. And so a question we can ask ourselves, is there evidence for this? Can we be confident? Can we know? Can we have assurance that Jesus really was raised from the dead? So I want to give you 10 different reasons, 10 different evidences that show, specifically when taken together, that Jesus was in fact raised from the dead. So here we go. Reason number one, the gospel authors say so. Now, a lot of people accuse the gospel authors of being biased, and therefore we can't trust them. They liked Jesus, they were followers of Jesus, therefore because they said Jesus rose from the dead, well obviously we can't trust their accounts because they were biased. But this really is a silly objection, right? The gospel authors, we can check in many different ways whether or not that what they're talking about really is reliable, whether it's trustworthy. So we can look at how the Gospels relate to the field of archaeology or other ancient records. We can look at internal consistency. We can look at the unity between the Gospel accounts. We can look at the differences and what some have called undesigned coincidences between the Gospel authors. And apart from the miraculous elements, we can look and see, are their accounts trustworthy? Are they reliable? Are they historically accurate? And time and again, we can answer that as yes. So just because they're biased doesn't mean that they're unreliable. Oftentimes, biased writers have a greater stake in getting the story right. And so whether or not they're biased is irrelevant. The question is, are they reliable? And if you examine the evidence, if you look at the reliability of the Gospels, time and again, the evidence says, yes, they are reliable. And therefore, this is one piece of evidence in favor of the resurrection because our reliable witnesses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, say that the resurrection happened. Reason number two, there was an empty tomb. So all the Gospels report or record that the disciples found the tomb empty, that where Jesus was buried, his body is no longer there. And from a historical standpoint, looking after the Gospel accounts, after the resurrection accounts, there's no way that the church would have gotten off of the ground if there was a body still in the tomb. And a couple other interesting points about this. In the book of Matthew, he talks about this rumor that was going around that people were accusing the disciples of having stolen the body of Jesus. So everybody who was opposed to the Christian movement wanted to stamp it out, and the easiest way would have been to point to the grave that Jesus was in. But obviously, it makes no sense that that grave was there with Jesus' body in it. And there's an interesting find in the field of archaeology. There was an antiques dealer who found this inscription. It's known as the Nazareth inscription. And it was an edict that talked about how people were going to be punished or penalized for moving bodies from graves. And it was from the Nazareth area, which really matches up with the phenomenon that would have happened around the time of Jesus, and particularly that rumor that Matthew talks about. So the empty tomb is our second piece of evidence that Jesus was bodily raised from the grave. Reason number three, post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to his disciples and to his followers. So one thing you'll find as you read through the New Testament accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then all the epistles, there's constant references to Jesus appearing to his disciples or some of his disciples after his resurrection. So you have instances of this in Acts. You have it talked about in the gospel accounts themselves. You also have Paul talking about Jesus appearing to him as well in what Paul was convinced was the resurrected body of Jesus, who did appear to him. And over again, you have individuals, you have small groups, and you have large groups where Jesus is appearing to these crowds. And the New Testament documents talk about this. And so part of their witness or testimony to the resurrection, the gospel account, was based on these eyewitness interactions they had with the risen Jesus. So the only way to get around this is to say that they're all lying or there was mass hallucinations or something of that sort, which those hypotheses are all ridiculous. So the multiple appearances of the raised Jesus is another evidence to point towards the real actual bodily resurrection of Jesus. It's the thing that best accounts for those facts that we have in terms of those appearances that the disciples and followers of Jesus had. All right, reason number 4 that we can trust in the accounts of the New Testament that Jesus was raised bodily from the grave is the amount of persecution and martyrdom we see in the first century. So the apostles specifically and other eyewitnesses of Jesus and those sort of in that early circle were, as a whole, willing to die for their conviction that Jesus was Lord and that he was raised from the dead. And all of the apostles and the authors of the New Testament, they either died for their faith or were willing to die for it. And so as we know, human beings are not willing to die for something that they know and are convinced in their mind is a lie. So people die for lies, but they're not aware that they're lies. And the disciples were in the best position to know whether or not Jesus really was raised from the dead or not. And they all, along with many, many others, were willing to go to their death in order to proclaim this truth. So they would not give hold of this belief or conviction that Jesus was raised from the grave. And this, again, counts as evidence towards the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Okay, reason number 5 is the uniqueness of the belief that Jesus had been raised bodily from the dead, and particularly by the disciples. So early in the first century, there was beliefs about the afterlife, that maybe your spirit left your body and that there was this spirit world or this afterlife. The Jews believed that, or at least many of them did, that there would be a resurrection at the very last day. But the idea that someone would come along and would die, and particularly the God-man would come along and die and then be raised bodily from the grave, was not a belief that was on anybody's radar. It's not something that, people were already cooking up and just waiting for the right time to be able to invent a story to make this belief a reality. Now, this is something new and fresh and really shocked and startled even the apostles, and you can read their accounts about this. And so this radical conviction, this new conviction, this idea of someone being raised bodily from the grave to a human being who died and then rose again is something that was just not on the radar. And that new belief that they had demands an explanation. And it was a sudden belief. It's not something that developed over decades and decades and decades or centuries. It was something that happened just like that. And that requires an explanation. And the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for where that belief originated. Okay, reason number 6. The disciples began, immediately after the resurrection, began worshiping Jesus as God. And in the book of Acts and all through the New Testament, you see this proclamation that Jesus is Lord, that he is the God-man, that he's the Son of God. Now, what's particularly interesting about this is that Jews were strict monotheists. They believed in one God, and that God was spirit, and that God, there was just one, right? It was not the polytheism of that day. But yet what we have happening right after the resurrection is this universal proclamation of the early church that Jesus was Lord, that he was God. And again, this calls for an explanation. It demands there to be an explanation of how did this happen? Where did this belief come from? And again, the best explanation is that Jesus really was raised from the dead. And this life-altering, this paradigm-shattering event, the resurrection, would have totally transformed their views about who Jesus was ultimately, and would have really settled that conviction that he was indeed the Son of God. And this definitely counts as evidence towards there being an actual event like the resurrection that happened that generated this new conviction that the disciples had. Okay, reason number 7 is early Christians, and even the Jewish Christians, began worshiping Jesus and celebrating the resurrection on the first day of the week. So these are Sabbath-adhering Jews who were still taking a day of rest on the Sabbath, on Saturday. And immediately after Jesus' death and the proclamation of his resurrection, Christians started worshiping on the first day of the week in commemoration or in celebration of something. And it was the resurrection that they were celebrating. So again, just like some of these other beliefs that the disciples had, that Jesus was God or they'd been raised from the dead, something caused this new day of worship for these early Christians. And again, the resurrection makes the most sense of this. They were celebrating something in this new institution, this new day of worship sort of sprang onto the scene. And the resurrection provides a fitting explanation of that and counts as additional evidence towards the case that we're making for the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, reason number 8 is the conversion of people who were haters or antagonists towards the person of Jesus. And 2 specific examples come to mind, and one of those is James, the brother of Jesus. And we see in the Gospels that even the siblings and some of the family members of Jesus did not believe that he was who he said he was. In fact, they probably thought he was a bit crazy for that. But yet we see James being converted after the resurrection of Jesus, and even writing one of the epistles that we find in the New Testament. And so what could take someone who probably knew about Jesus better than anybody, someone who was raised with him, and turn that person from a skeptic or a doubter about your brother to someone who believed that he was the Son of God and raised from the dead, and then died a martyr's death in holding fast to that belief? There must have been something that happened that would have caused this sort of belief in James, the resurrection. Another example of this is the Apostle Paul, who was a persecutor of Christians and was opposed to the Christian movement and opposed to Jesus. And yet we see this radical conversion in Paul, and we see this documented in the New Testament. We see the way Paul was before and the way he was after, and you can read his letters and get a feel for what this conversion was like for him. And again, that demands an explanation, and it lines up with all these other evidences that we're seeing at play here, and that something radical happened to Paul. And what Paul says is it was an encounter with the risen Jesus, and that turned his world upside down and shattered his belief system, and he became convinced, from being an opponent and a persecutor of Christians to someone who worshiped Jesus as the risen Lord. All right, reason number 9 is the existence of the church. So every movement, religious movement or any other movement, requires an explanation or a cause for how it got started. And what was the catalyst behind it. And for a lot of religious movements, it was some sort of political or taking over some territory or that sort of thing that they got things started. And you really see this with something like Islam. Now, the claim for Christianity is that the resurrection of Jesus was the catalyst for getting the church going. And so Christianity as a whole doesn't exist without the resurrection. And so you had this movement, this tiny movement at the very beginning that exploded onto the scene, spreading in an area that was fairly hostile to the early Christians. And it spread like wildfire. And this turns from 10, 20, several hundred to several thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people, and now millions and even billions of people in the world. And this institution that got its start, it demands a cause or an explanation for how it got off the ground and how it got started. And the claim is now and has always been that the resurrection is that thing that makes the church tick. It's the thing that is the reason that the church exists. And it's hard to explain the creation or the formation or the explosion of the church in the first century without the resurrection of Jesus. There's no other event or cause that seems to make sense of the creation of this massive movement except for the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, reason number 10 is a bit more of a personal reason, and it's not necessarily historical, but the resurrection makes sense of life. So as you begin to think about the resurrection and the gospel message, so really the story of Scripture and its culmination in the cross, the resurrection is this fitting climax to the story of humanity and really fits the longings of the human heart. So as human beings, we long for life after death. So we see something wrong with life. We see that pain and suffering and ultimately death is fundamentally wrong. Like, it's not the way it's supposed to be. And we're looking for something that will alleviate the pain that's associated with that. But then on top of that, we know that we want to be loved, we want to be accepted. We also know that we have committed great wrongs and there's something fundamentally wrong with us as individuals. So we all live with guilt and shame and negative feelings and emotions about ourselves. So we recognize there's something really good, but also something really wrong with us as well. And see, this whole collection of desires and longings, etc., that we feel as human beings, and all of those seem to find a fitting solution or an answer to all those issues right at the cross. So we find love and acceptance, we find forgiveness, we find this washing away of shame, we find this hope that death is not the end, that death is defeated. And we find it in someone like us, a human being. And we also are longing for this connection with the transcendent. And here we find that God has stooped down and came to save sinners. So all of the longings that we search within ourselves, the longings that we're just sort of hardwired with, that we find to be the nature of our own human experience, find a fitting resolution at the cross. It's like the cross is the key that fits the lock to the human heart. So as we look at all of these 10 evidences, most of them historical, even a personal one there at the end. If you look at these as a cumulative whole, they all begin to add weight to the idea that Jesus was raised from the dead. So none of these evidences all by themselves is maybe going to do it for you. But as you begin to add one after another, it's sort of like taking a strand of rope and then intertwining it with another and another and another, and soon you have a multi-stranded rope that can't be broken. And the evidence for the resurrection is sort of like that. As you begin to add piece upon piece, layer upon layer, you see that the case for the resurrection gets stronger and stronger. And it seems to me that the evidence for this is overwhelming. And Christians are on solid footing when they say that Jesus was raised from the dead, and we can know that. So I would encourage you to check out the evidence for this and really wrestle with the claims of Christ. Look at the evidence for his resurrection and see if it is not persuasive to you, and see if Christ can't experientially change your life.